Mason Hayes returned to his mountain cabin on short leave, carrying silence heavier than his pack. That night, a wounded German shepherd collapsed at his door, a steel snare cut deep into her leg. But her eyes were not asking for help for herself. She kept turning toward the storm, as if something more important had been left behind. When she forced herself back into the blizzard, Mason followed her into the trees. Hidden beneath fallen branches, 3 newborn puppies lay freezing, their shelter collapsing under fresh snow. What began as a desperate rescue would uncover illegal traps, marked trees, and a network cutting through protected land. With redeployment days away, Mason now faced a battle no war had prepared him for. And before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of courage, faith, and second chances. Wind and snow tore across the Cascade Mountains, swallowing the narrow roads above Cedar Ridge in a blur of white and ice. Lieutenant Mason Hayes stood on the porch of his family's old cabin, shoulders squared as if he were still standing inspection. At 35, he carried the compact, disciplined strength of an active-duty Navy SEAL, lean muscle built from years of combat training rather than vanity. His dark brown hair was cut short in regulation style, high and tight at the sides, the top slightly textured but practical. A very short beard shadowed his angular jaw, emphasizing the sharp lines of a face weathered by sun, sand, and sleepless deployments. His steel blue eyes, usually steady and unreadable during operations, now held a deeper weight. He was home on a 10-day leave before redeploying overseas. Officially, he was here to rest. In truth, he was here because silence in the mountains felt easier than silence in his own mind. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of pine wood and smoke. Mason dropped his duffel near the door and moved through the small space with the controlled economy of someone trained to conserve motion. On the far wall hung a framed photograph of him and Staff Sergeant Daniel Brooks. Daniel had been taller, broader, with a thick mustache, and a grin that rarely left his face. He had been the loud one in the unit, the man who told bad jokes before breaching doors and called everyone brother, whether they liked it or not. 3 months ago, Daniel had stepped into a kill zone during a mission gone sideways. Mason still replayed the moment in his head. If he had given the command sooner, if he had seen the glint in the window, if he had moved half a second faster. Guilt had a way of rewriting time, convincing a man that control had been within reach. The storm intensified as night deepened. Snow struck the windows in sharp bursts, and the wind pressed against the cabin walls like a living thing. Mason sat in a wooden chair by the fire, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely together. Out here, the world should have felt quiet, pure, untouched by war. But the human mind doesn't recognize geography. Every crack of wind against the roof echoed like distant rotor blades. Every sudden gust felt like incoming fire. He told himself to breathe, slow and steady, just as he had trained countless times. Control what you can. Release what you can't. Yet control had abandoned him on that last mission, and the memory clung like frost that refused to melt. Close to midnight, between 2 violent gusts of wind, Mason heard something that did not belong to the storm. A dull, uneven thud against the front door. He lifted his head, instantly alert. The sound came again, weak, scraping, followed by a pause. Not random. Not the rhythm of branches. His posture shifted subtly, every muscle aligning with instinct. He stood and crossed the room without noise, his boots silent against the wooden floor. Years of training moved him before conscious thought could interfere. He unlatched the door slowly, bracing himself as he pulled it open. A blast of snow and freezing air surged inside. On the porch, illuminated by the dim exterior light, stood a German shepherd. She was medium-sized, but powerfully built, clearly a working-line dog. Athletic frame, deep chest, long muzzle, ears upright despite exhaustion. Her coat, black over the back and rich tan along the legs and face, was soaked and streaked with blood. Her left hind leg bore a deep gash, the fur around it matted dark and stiff. Her sides trembled from cold and strain. Her belly was heavy with milk. She had given birth recently, but there were no puppies in sight. Her amber eyes met his, not wild with fear, but fixed with intention. She did not snarl. She did not retreat. She simply stood there, breathing hard, as if she had chosen this door deliberately and had nothing left after reaching it. Mason had seen that look before. The look of someone who had pushed beyond endurance and refused to fall until the mission was complete. Snow gathered along her back, and when another gust struck, her body wavered but did not collapse. She shifted slightly, angling her body as if shielding something behind her. There was nothing visible in the darkness beyond, only swirling white. Mason stepped forward and crouched, ignoring the cold soaking through his jeans. He extended his hand slowly, palm down. The dog flinched at first, muscles tightening, but she did not snap. Instead, she lowered her head a fraction, a fragile balance between caution and trust. Up close, he could see the metallic groove above the wound, too clean to be caused by rock or branch. A snare trap. Industrial wire. His jaw tightened. That meant this wasn't an accident. And if she had been caught, there was a reason she had fought her way free. The weight of her milk-heavy belly confirmed what his mind had already calculated. Somewhere out there, in this storm, were her puppies. For a moment, Mason hesitated, not out of fear, but out of something more complicated. Attachment was risk. Responsibility was weight. He had failed to bring one man home. He had sworn not to carry anything fragile again. But the dog's breathing grew more ragged, and her legs buckled beneath her. She did not cry out. She simply tried to rise again. That quiet determination broke something inside him more effectively than any plea could have. He slid one arm beneath her chest and the other under her hips, lifting her carefully. She was lighter than she should have been. He carried her into the cabin and shut the door firmly against the storm. The wind continued to howl outside, but inside, the firelight painted warm gold across her wet fur. He laid her down near the hearth, grabbed a towel, and began cleaning the wound with steady, deliberate hands. She watched him the entire time, eyes never fully closing. There was no name for her yet, no history he understood. Only the undeniable truth pressing against his chest. She had reached his cabin for a reason, and somewhere in the white darkness beyond the trees, small lives were waiting. Morning broke gray and silent over the Cascades. The storm reduced to a fine drift of snow clinging to pine branches like ash after fire. Inside the cabin, Mason Hayes knelt beside the German Shepherd, the fire casting steady light over her injured leg. He had cleaned the wound through most of the night, trimming away matted fur with careful precision, disinfecting the deep cut despite her occasional tremor. Up close, the damage told a clear story. A narrow groove pressed into muscle above the laceration. Bruised edges shaped too evenly to be rock or debris. This had been steel. Industrial snare wire, strong enough to hold deer or coyote. Mason's jaw tightened as he rewrapped the bandage with firm but measured hands. This forest was designated conservation land. Traps like that didn't belong here. The shepherd watched him with guarded intelligence, her amber eyes alert despite exhaustion. She was no stray. Her frame was athletic, her posture disciplined even in pain. Somewhere out there, beyond the frozen tree line, something had forced her to run. He rose and stepped to the window. Snow had thinned into low cloud and mist, revealing dark tree trunks and broken branches where the storm had torn through. His mind shifted automatically into assessment mode. Entry points, trails, likely trap lines. He had spent years reading terrain in hostile countries, and though this was Washington State and not a desert war zone, the skill translated cleanly. If someone was setting snares in protected land, it was deliberate, and deliberate meant organized. He glanced back at the shepherd. She tried to push herself upright, weight shifting awkwardly, gaze fixed on the door. Not fear. Urgency. She let out a low, restrained whine, then looked back at him as if expecting him to understand. Mason felt a familiar tension in his chest. Responsibility. He had not yet decided whether he was ready to carry that again. 40 miles down the mountain, in the small ranger station outside Cedar Ridge, Olivia Brooks stood over a cluttered wooden desk with a county map spread beneath her hands. At 32, she was tall and lean, with long legs built for hiking steep trails rather than sitting behind paperwork. Her dark blonde hair was pulled into a tight braid that fell between her shoulder blades, practical and no nonsense. Her skin was lightly freckled from years under mountain sun, and her gray-green eyes carried the sharp attentiveness of someone who missed very little. Olivia had grown up in logging country, but chosen conservation over industry after her father lost 2 fingers in a mill accident that had exposed unsafe, illegal practices. Since then, she had little tolerance for men who treated forests like disposable profit. This morning, she was studying fresh satellite updates and storm reports when a volunteer called in about unusual tire tracks cutting into restricted western slopes. By mid-morning, Olivia had driven her Forest Service truck up a partially cleared access road. The air was damp, heavy with thawing snow. She stepped out and crouched near a cluster of trees marked with fresh orange paint. The lines were too recent to have weathered. Nearby, the ground showed impressions of heavy-duty truck tires, their treads deep and angled for traction. She ran a gloved finger along the bark where it had been shaved to mark direction. Not amateur work. Someone had scouted carefully. She stood, scanning the ridgeline, calculating how far equipment could travel undetected during a storm. The answer unsettled her. A bad weather window was perfect cover for illegal hauling. When her radio crackled with a report of a wounded dog sighted near an isolated cabin higher up the slope, she felt something click into place. Traps drove wildlife out. Clear the animals, clear the land. Back at the cabin, the shepherd's restlessness increased. She struggled to her feet again, though Mason gently pressed her back down. Her muscles quivered, but her eyes stayed locked on the door. He watched her breathing, steady but strained. She wasn't panicking. She was thinking. He had worked alongside military working dogs during joint operations overseas. He knew the difference between fear and intention. This was intention. She nudged his arm once, then twice, and turned her head toward the snow-covered trees. Mason exhaled slowly. "You're not done," he muttered under his breath. The realization settled heavily. If she had left her pups behind to seek help, then every passing hour reduced their chance of survival. The thought tightened something in his chest that felt too close to memory. He grabbed his field jacket and rifle, moving with renewed clarity. He told himself this was reconnaissance. A search. Tactical movement through terrain. It was easier to frame it that way than to admit he cared. The shepherd tried to follow, but faltered, leg refusing full weight. He crouched beside her and met her eyes again. "Stay," he said quietly, the word instinctive from years of K9 protocol exposure. She held his gaze, then reluctantly lowered herself to the floor. There was trust there now. Fragile, but growing. Mason stepped outside into the thin fog, scanning the ground for tracks not yet buried by drifting snow. Small paw prints were visible, faint but leading northwest. He felt the old focus settle in, calm and sharp. Several miles down the ridge, Olivia received confirmation from a county deputy that snares had been found in a similar zone 2 weeks prior. The deputy mentioned a name quietly. Ethan Kroll, late 40s, gaunt build, hollow cheeks, shadowed by patchy dark stubble. A man known for minor logging violations and aggressive temper. He had once threatened a survey crew that reported him. Olivia remembered him. Restless eyes, too quick to smile without warmth. The pattern forming in her mind was no longer abstract. Traps to drive animals out. Marked trees. Heavy equipment tracks. And now a wounded shepherd likely caught in one of those snares. Her jaw tightened. She had seen greed disguised as survival before. It always left scars deeper than steel. Up on the mountain, Mason followed the fading trail, his boots cutting clean impressions in damp snow. Each step felt like walking a thin line between past and present. He told himself this was about the dog, about finishing what she started. But beneath that logic was something quieter and more dangerous. A chance not to fail again. The wind had calmed, leaving the forest unnaturally still. Somewhere ahead, beyond the next ridge break, life was either waiting or already gone. Mason adjusted his grip on the rifle and moved forward, knowing that whatever he found would decide more than the fate of a few helpless animals. This story contains fictionalized elements for entertainment and educational purposes. The sky hung low and colorless over the ridge, the storm reduced to a bitter wind that swept loose snow across the frozen ground in restless waves. Mason Hayes had barely reached the tree line when he heard the faintest sound carried between gusts of wind. Not the creak of branches, not the distant crack of ice shifting. A thin, fragile cry that did not belong to the forest. He moved toward it instinctively, boots cutting through crusted snow, rifle slung securely across his back. The German shepherd had followed, despite his command to stay, limping behind him with stubborn determination. Her injured leg trembled with every step, but she did not slow. Her amber eyes were fixed forward, ears angled toward the sound only she seemed to detect clearly. Mason recognized that focus. It was the same look he had seen in military working dogs before they alerted to explosives. Certainty without hesitation. If she believed something was there, he would trust it. The trail curved around a broken cluster of fir trees where the storm had forced heavy limbs to collapse. Beneath the fallen branches, partially buried by drifted snow, Mason saw the outline of a shallow rock hollow. The entrance was nearly sealed by ice and debris. Another cry escaped from within, weaker this time. Mason dropped to one knee and began clearing snow with gloved hands, tossing aside chunks of frozen bark and splintered wood. The shepherd pushed closer, whining low in her throat, nose thrust forward despite the cold. When Mason finally exposed the hollow's opening, he saw movement inside. Small, trembling shapes pressed together for warmth. 3 newborn German shepherd puppies, no more than a few days old, their coats still soft and thin, bodies fragile against the brutal mountain air. The first puppy he lifted was the largest of the 3, a dark sable male with oversized paws and a strong, stubborn wiggle despite the cold. His tiny muzzle opened in a silent protest as Mason tucked him into the inside of his jacket. The second was smaller, her coat lighter with faint tan markings already visible along her face. She trembled violently, her breathing shallow. The third lay nearly motionless at the back of the hollow, ribs faintly visible beneath damp fur. Mason's chest tightened at the sight. He had seen bodies too still before. For one terrifying second, he feared he was too late again. He slid both hands beneath the smallest pup, lifting carefully, pressing the tiny form against his chest. A faint heartbeat fluttered beneath his palm. Not gone. Not yet. The wind shifted sharply, cutting through his jacket and freezing the moisture on his face. The shepherd hovered close, nose touching each puppy as Mason secured them against his body. Snow swirled harder now, threatening to seal the hollow again. He rose with steady urgency, adjusting his stance to balance the fragile weight he carried. As he began the climb back toward the cabin, a familiar pressure built behind his ribs. The sensation was almost physical, like the moment before an explosion when the air changes. He saw Daniel's face in his mind, dusty, bleeding, eyes searching for reassurance Mason had not been able to give in time. He remembered kneeling in sand instead of snow, holding a life that slipped away despite every effort. His throat tightened. Not this time. Halfway up the slope, the smallest puppy's body went slack against his chest. Mason stopped abruptly, heart pounding now in a way combat had not triggered in years. He crouched behind a fallen log to shield them from the wind and unzipped his jacket slightly. The pup's head lolled weakly, mouth parted, breath barely visible. Mason pressed 2 fingers gently against its tiny ribcage, feeling for rhythm. There it was, faint but present. He tucked the pup deeper into the warmth against his thermal layer, using his own body heat the way he had once done for wounded men slipping into shock. "Stay with me," he whispered under his breath, unaware that the words echoed something he had said in a different place, under a different sky. Back at the cabin, he moved quickly, but with deliberate care. He laid the puppies on a folded wool blanket near the fire and knelt beside them, hands steady despite the storm raging inside his chest. The shepherd collapsed near them, exhausted, immediately curling her body protectively around the two stronger pups, while Mason kept the smallest one against his chest. He prepared warm water, soaked towels, and wrapped a hot water bottle in cloth to avoid burning fragile skin. Every motion was precise, controlled. Control was survival. Yet beneath that discipline, emotion pressed hard against him. These were not soldiers. They did not choose the fight. They had been dragged into it by human greed and steel traps hidden in snow. The smallest puppy began to shiver differently now, not from cold alone, but from weakness. Mason adjusted the blanket and checked the pup's gums, pale but responsive. He had studied emergency care during deployments, learned to stabilize injuries in environments where medevac was hours away. He applied that same knowledge here, refusing to let panic cloud his actions. The shepherd watched him closely, amber eyes softer now, trust building with every careful movement. She nudged his arm once, as if acknowledging his effort. Mason swallowed hard. He had spent months convincing himself he should not carry responsibility for fragile lives again. Yet here he was, doing exactly that. Night fell again over the Cascades. Quieter this time, the storm fading to distant wind. The fire crackled steadily, casting flickering shadows along the cabin walls. Mason sat on the floor with his back against the couch, the smallest pup tucked securely inside his jacket, heartbeat gradually strengthening against his sternum. The two stronger puppies had begun nursing, their tiny bodies pushing weakly but determinedly against their mother's side. Mason closed his eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, but in something deeper. He had not prayed since Daniel died. He had told himself faith belonged to men who believed outcomes could be changed. Yet as he felt the fragile pulse beneath his hand, words formed without strategy or pride. "Please," he murmured quietly into the dim room. "Just let this one live." For the first time in months, his request was not about forgiveness or escape. It was about preserving something smaller than himself. The cabin felt different now, less like a bunker against memory, and more like a fragile sanctuary. Mason opened his eyes and looked at the shepherd, who held his gaze steadily before lowering her head to rest beside her nursing pups. 3 lives had been pulled from snow and steel because she refused to give up. And tonight, Mason Hayes refused as well. He would fight through the night to keep them warm, to keep them breathing, to make sure no life slipped from his hands again. Low clouds drifted through the pines, and melting snow slid from the cabin roof in steady drops that sounded almost like a ticking clock. Mason Hayes had just finished reinforcing the bandage on the shepherd's leg when he heard the distant growl of an engine climbing the lower service road. His body reacted before his thoughts did. He rose smoothly, shoulders tightening, every instinct recalibrating from caretaker back to operator. He stepped onto the porch, posture relaxed but alert, eyes scanning the tree line and slope angles automatically. A Forest Service truck came into view between thinning fog, mud splashed along its sides. The vehicle stopped several yards from the cabin, and a woman stepped out with deliberate confidence, boots crunching over slushy ground as she approached. Mason remained still, hands visible, but his mind measured distance, cover, and intent. He had learned long ago that not every uniform carried the same definition of authority. Olivia Brooks closed the truck door with a controlled motion and adjusted the strap of the radio clipped at her shoulder. Up close, she stood nearly 5'10", long-limbed and strong without excess weight, the kind of build shaped by years hiking steep terrain in all weather. Her dark blonde hair was braided tightly down her back, practical and wind-resistant, and her gray-green eyes assessed Mason in one steady sweep. There was nothing hesitant about her gaze. A faint scar ran along her left forearm, pale against sun-weathered skin, a remnant of a wildfire rescue years earlier that had nearly taken her life and permanently altered her tolerance for negligence. Her expression carried neither hostility nor warmth, only professional caution. "Lieutenant Hayes?" she asked evenly, voice low but clear. Mason nodded once. Up close, the contrast between them was quiet but palpable. His squared shoulders, disciplined stance, and the subtle stiffness in his movements spoke of military command. Her stance, balanced and grounded, reflected someone accustomed to enforcing law in isolation. She explained that she had followed recent storm damage reports and illegal trail markings leading toward this section of the ridge. When she mentioned snares found in nearby zones, Mason's jaw tightened. He stepped aside without invitation, but not without purpose, allowing her a view inside the cabin. The shepherd lifted her head immediately, ears alert, though her body remained protective over the nursing pups. Olivia knelt slowly a few feet from the dog, gloved hands visible and movements calm. She did not rush, allowing the shepherd to scent her first. "Easy," she murmured softly, tone steady. The shepherd's amber eyes studied her, wary but not aggressive. Olivia leaned closer to examine the bandaged leg, fingers gently parting the cloth. Her brow furrowed almost imperceptibly. "This is a steel cable snare," she said, voice tightening slightly. "Industrial grade, not something a weekend hunter carries." Mason watched her closely, not just her words but her reactions. There was anger there, but controlled, like his own. She explained that illegal logging crews sometimes set traps along animal corridors to push wildlife away from intended cutting zones. It was efficient, it was cruel, and it was deliberate. Mason stepped back to the doorway, glancing toward the tree line as if he could see the pattern forming in real time. A new trail cut west of the ridge, fresh tire impressions, steel snares placed strategically. He had spent his career identifying hostile networks in unfamiliar terrain. This felt no different, except the battleground was American soil. "How close?" he asked quietly. Olivia stood, brushing snow from her knees. "Close enough to matter," she replied, "and close enough that whoever's running it knows exactly what they're doing." For a moment, silence settled between them, not tense, but heavy with shared understanding. Two professionals recognizing escalation. Inside, the smallest puppy let out a thin cry, and Mason's head turned instantly. The sound struck deeper than he expected. Olivia noticed the shift in him, the subtle fracture in his otherwise rigid composure. She followed him inside and paused near the hearth. The larger male pup, dark sable and already sturdier than his siblings, wriggled blindly toward his mother's warmth. The lighter female trembled, but continued nursing. The smallest lay wrapped in extra cloth, chest rising shallowly. Olivia's expression softened, though her voice remained firm. "They're lucky," she said quietly. Mason exhaled slowly. "No," he replied after a pause. "She is." His phone vibrated against the kitchen counter, the sharp buzz cutting through the quiet room. Mason crossed the cabin in 3 strides and glanced at the screen. "Command." His face hardened reflexively before he answered. The voice on the other end belonged to Commander Travis Cole, a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with close-cropped black hair and a habit of speaking in clipped precision. Cole had built his reputation on mission success rates, not emotional nuance. He informed Mason that redeployment orders were confirmed. Wheels up in 8 days. Mason responded with measured acknowledgement, voice steady despite the tightening in his chest. When he ended the call, the cabin felt smaller somehow. Olivia observed the change in his posture. "You're deploying again," she said, not as a question. Mason nodded once. 8 days. The words lingered heavier than the snowfall outside. He looked at the shepherd and the pups, then back toward the forest. The calculus shifted inside him. If organized logging crews were operating this close, if snares were being set within yards of his cabin, then leaving in 8 days meant abandoning unfinished ground. He had never walked away from a threat mid-operation. Yet this was not his official battlefield. It was not his jurisdiction. The conflict was internal, silent, but intense. Responsibility pulled in two directions. Olivia stepped closer to the window, scanning the ridge thoughtfully. "I can escalate the investigation," she said, "but I need evidence strong enough to shut them down fast." Her tone carried resolve sharpened by past failures she refused to repeat. Mason recognized that tone. He had used it himself before missions that carried too much risk. He met her eyes again, something unspoken aligning between them. Neither was reckless, neither tolerated injustice. Outside, the wind shifted again, brushing the treetops with a warning whisper. Inside the cabin, the shepherd lowered her head protectively over her pups. Mason felt the weight of the clock pressing forward. He turned back toward the firelight, decision not yet spoken, but forming. 8 days before redeployment. A network operating under cover of storm and steel. 3 fragile lives breathing under his roof. The ridge no longer felt like a retreat. It felt like contested ground. And whether he wore a uniform or not, Mason Hayes understood one truth clearly. He was standing in the middle of something larger than coincidence, and walking away would not silence it. Rain returned after midnight, thin and relentless, sliding off the pine needles and soaking into the half-frozen ground around the cabin. Mason Hayes had been awake for hours, seated in the wooden chair near the front window, rifle resting within reach, but not in his hands. The fire had burned down to steady embers, painting the cabin in a low orange glow. The German shepherd lay close to her pups, though she had not fully slept. Every few minutes, her ears flicked toward the forest, body tense despite exhaustion. Mason had learned to read that tension. It wasn't ordinary caution, it was anticipation. When the first sharp bark split the quiet, it was not frantic. It was precise, a warning. Mason stood instantly, the transition from stillness to motion seamless, muscle memory guiding him before thought caught up. He stepped onto the porch into the cold rain, breath steady, eyes adjusting to the darkness. The beam of his flashlight swept across wet ground and tree trunks. At first he saw nothing. Then he noticed it. Metal glinting faintly just beyond the edge of the porch steps. A steel snare, freshly set, positioned exactly along the narrow path where the puppies would eventually wander once stronger. Mason felt a cold clarity settle in his mind. This was no coincidence. Whoever placed it had studied the cabin. The shepherd barked again, low and fierce, her injured leg braced beneath her as she moved to stand beside him. From the shadows between 2 fir trees, a figure shifted. A man stepped forward slowly, rain dripping from the brim of a worn hunting cap. Derek Sloan was taller than Mason had expected, lanky but wiry, late 30s, with sharp cheekbones and a narrow jaw shadowed by uneven dark stubble. His eyes were pale and restless, never holding contact too long, as though measuring exits even while standing still. He wore a heavy canvas jacket streaked with mud, gloves half removed, and carried a coil of steel cable in one hand. There was something in his posture that spoke of habitual resentment, the slight forward tilt of someone accustomed to arguing before listening. Derek's reputation in Cedar Ridge was well known, suspected in illegal logging operations for years, clever enough to avoid direct charges, patient enough to let others take the fall. "You're on private land," Derek said flatly, though his gaze flicked past Mason toward the cabin window where faint movement from the pups cast soft shadows. His voice carried a dry edge, like gravel scraped across concrete. Mason did not respond immediately. He stepped forward one controlled pace, positioning himself between Derek and the porch. "You set that snare?" he asked calmly. Derek shrugged, the gesture deliberately careless. "Forests full of predators, just protecting what's mine." The lie hung thin in the rain. Mason's eyes dropped briefly to the ground, noting boot impressions identical to those Olivia had described. Calculations moved through his mind quickly. Distance, reach, the coil of cable in Derek's grip. The shepherd's growl deepened, vibrating through the damp air. Derek's hand twitched slightly toward his jacket pocket, and that small motion was enough. Mason closed the distance in 2 fluid steps, seizing Derek's wrist and twisting it outward with controlled force. The coil of cable fell into the mud with a dull metallic thud. Derek reacted instinctively, lunging with surprising speed, but Mason's stance held firm. Years of close-quarters training surfaced effortlessly. Balance low, center anchored. He maneuvered Derek down onto one knee without striking him, keeping pressure precise and within legal restraint limits. Rain soaked through Mason's sleeves, but his grip remained unshaken. For a split second, as Derek struggled and the fallen cable struck a rock, the sharp clang of metal echoed through the clearing. The sound sliced through Mason's awareness like a blade. In an instant, the forest vanished. He saw sand instead of mud, heard gunfire instead of rain. Daniel's body falling, the metallic snap of rifle parts hitting ground. Mason's hands tightened involuntarily, breath shortening. Derek's resistance blurred into something else entirely. For one terrifying heartbeat, the present and the past overlapped so completely he could not separate them. His chest constricted, vision narrowing at the edges. The shepherd's bark cut through the distortion, sharp and immediate, not panicked, commanding. Mason blinked hard, rain replacing desert dust, pine replacing smoke. He adjusted his grip, forcing himself back into control. He was not overseas. This was not a battlefield. Derek was not an insurgent. He exhaled slowly and recentered, maintaining the hold without escalating it. Moments later, headlights appeared through the trees, cutting pale beams through the rain. Olivia's truck stopped sharply near the lower slope. She stepped out with measured urgency, hand resting near her sidearm but not drawing it. Olivia assessed the scene quickly. Derek in mud, restrained but not injured. Mason steady, breathing controlled though. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead. She approached with firm authority. "Derek Sloan," she said evenly, voice carrying a warning that did not need volume. "Setting snares in a protected corridor is a felony." Derek's expression shifted from defiance to calculation. "You've got nothing tying this to me," he muttered. Olivia's jaw set. "We'll see about that." She radioed county support, tone crisp and unshaken. Mason stepped back only when she signaled control had transferred, his movements deliberate, avoiding unnecessary force. Within 20 minutes, county deputies arrived. One of them, Deputy Marcus Hale, broad-shouldered and middle-aged, with graying hair and a patient demeanor shaped by years of small-town enforcement, cuffed Derek without drama. Marcus had once been a high school football coach before entering law enforcement, and his steady presence calmed volatile situations more often than weapons did. Derek was escorted to the cruiser, rain streaking his face, eyes still calculating angles even in defeat. Mason watched silently, hands flexing once before relaxing. As the vehicles pulled away, rain softened into mist. Olivia remained on the porch, studying Mason carefully. She had noticed the brief flicker in his composure when metal struck stone. She did not comment directly, but her voice lowered. "You all right?" Mason nodded once, though the answer felt incomplete. Inside, the shepherd had returned to her pups, pressing her body around them protectively. Mason glanced back at the cabin, then toward the forest beyond. Derek Sloan was only one man. The snare lines, the marked trees, the heavy equipment tracks, all of it pointed to something larger. The night had confirmed it. Mason stepped back into the cabin, closing the door firmly against the damp air. The fire crackled softly, the smallest pup stirring weakly but alive. He knelt beside them, steadying his breathing. The confrontation had ended without bloodshed. Derek was in custody. But as Mason rested his hand gently along the shepherd's neck, he understood that the threat extended far beyond one man with a coil of steel. And with 8 days before redeployment, time was narrowing around him faster than the storm clouds had. Morning sunlight filtered weakly through thinning clouds, touching the forest floor with a pale gold that felt almost cautious after so many days of storm. 3 days after Derek Sloan's arrest, the mountain felt different. Not calmer, exactly, but expectant. Mason Hayes stood near the edge of the clearing behind his cabin, watching as 2 state vehicles crawled slowly along the lower ridge road. The investigation had moved faster than he anticipated. Derek had talked. Not everything, but enough. Names, drop points, equipment storage sites, enough to expose something larger than a lone man setting snares in the rain. Mason's posture remained composed, shoulders squared, but inside he felt the shifting weight of a mission that no longer belonged solely to him. For the first time since returning to the Cascades, he was not alone in confronting the threat. Sheriff Robert "Rob" Callahan arrived shortly after sunrise. Rob was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered with a thick build softened slightly by age, but not by complacency. His silver hair was cropped short, and a neatly trimmed mustache framed a mouth that rarely wasted words. Years of law enforcement in a mountain county had given him a patient demeanor and a deeply rooted sense of territorial loyalty. He carried himself like a man who understood that the land shaped the people more than the other way around. Rob had known Mason's father years ago and treated Mason with the measured respect reserved for those who carried service in their bones. "We found the staging yard," Rob said without preamble. "It's bigger than we thought." The operation stretched farther west than Olivia Brooks had suspected. Heavy machinery had been hidden beneath camouflaged tarps in a ravine, shielded by dense cedar growth. Marked trees extended in a grid pattern, systematic and calculated. State investigators identified forged permits and falsified transport manifests. Mason listened as Rob explained the coordination between county deputies and state forestry enforcement. There was no triumph in Rob's voice, only resolve. He had seen greed before. What disturbed him was the scale. "They were clearing wildlife corridors on purpose," Rob added. "Drive animals out, make the land look empty. Easier to cut when no one's watching." Mason felt a slow heat build in his chest. He understood tactics. He also understood the cost of deliberate harm. Later that afternoon, Olivia climbed the ridge path to the cabin with a folder tucked beneath her arm. Her braid was slightly looser today, a few strands catching in the breeze, and fatigue traced faint shadows under her eyes. Yet her steps remained steady. She had spent the last 48 hours coordinating with state investigators and documenting snare sites personally. Her commitment was not abstract, it was intimate. She had once lost a partner during a wildfire evacuation when faulty equipment failed under illegal logging debris left behind by contractors. That history sharpened her intolerance for corruption. "They're charging 3 contractors in addition to Sloan," she said, as she joined Mason near the porch. "Racketeering? Environmental destruction? Illegal trapping?" There was satisfaction in her tone, but it was tempered by something quieter. Relief. Inside the cabin, the 3 German Shepherd puppies were no longer silent bundles of fur. The largest male, dark sable and already showing signs of bold temperament, stumbled forward on unsteady legs toward Mason's boots. His oversized paws made his movements clumsy but determined. The lighter female followed more cautiously, her eyes bright and observant, often watching before moving. The smallest, still leaner than the others but stronger each day, lay curled near their mother's flank, breathing evenly. The shepherd herself, her leg healing steadily, watched Mason approach with softened intensity. Trust had replaced suspicion. Mason crouched and allowed the sable pup to climb awkwardly onto his knee. The tiny weight pressed into him, grounding and alive. He felt the bond forming whether he intended it or not. Each time one of them cried, he responded without hesitation. Each time the shepherd's gaze sought reassurance, he met it steadily. It unsettled him more than combat had. Attachment had once been a liability, something he compartmentalized to survive deployment after deployment. But here, beneath the tall cedar canopy, he found himself recalibrating what strength meant. It was not only endurance under fire, it was staying present when something fragile depended on you. Olivia noticed the subtle shifts in him, the way his voice lowered when he spoke to the pups, the way his posture relaxed fractionally in their presence. She did not comment. She understood healing often happened in silence. 2 days later, Mason accompanied Rob and Olivia to the western ravine, where the hidden logging equipment had been seized. State forestry investigator Daniel Mercer, no relation to Mason despite the shared surname, met them there. Daniel was tall and thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and a thoughtful, analytical demeanor that contrasted sharply with Rob's grounded authority. His dark hair was streaked prematurely with gray from years spent untangling financial fraud within environmental crimes. He explained how forged permits had been used to move timber across county lines, laundering profits through shell companies. Mason listened with the same focus he once reserved for intelligence briefings overseas. The structure of the operation mirrored organized insurgent funding networks he had studied, diversified, layered, insulated against exposure. As machinery was hauled away and evidence cataloged, the forest began to feel reclaimed. Wildlife tracks reappeared near cleared snare lines. Birds returned cautiously to branches once disturbed by noise. Mason stood beside Olivia at the edge of the ravine, hands resting loosely at his sides. "You did good," she said quietly. Not as praise, but acknowledgement. He shook his head once. "She did," he replied, glancing toward the distant cabin where the shepherd rested with her pups. It was her escape from steel that exposed everything. Olivia followed his gaze and allowed a faint smile to touch her lips. "Sometimes survival starts the investigation," she said. That evening, back at the cabin, the fire burned low while the puppies explored in widening circles. Mason sat on the floor, back against the couch, watching them with a steadiness that no longer felt forced. He still had 5 days before redeployment. The call would come again, and he would answer. That part of his identity had not changed, but something else had shifted beneath the canopy of pine and cedar. The forest was safer. The network had been dismantled. Cedar Ridge would not wake to chainsaws cutting protected land. And inside the cabin, 3 small lives continued to grow stronger with each passing day. Mason reached forward and let the smallest pup press against his palm. The warmth felt real, solid. He understood now that protecting something did not always mean carrying a weapon across oceans. Sometimes it meant staying long enough to see the truth uncovered and ensuring that harm did not repeat. Outside, the wind moved gently through branches, no longer a threat, but a reminder of endurance. Mason exhaled slowly, allowing himself one rare, unguarded moment of quiet certainty. The forest had been defended. The pups were healing. And for the first time since Daniel's death, Mason Hayes felt that staying present had mattered. Early spring sunlight spilled across the clearing, melting the last stubborn patches of snow into thin silver streams that traced the slope below the cabin. Mason Hayes stood on the porch with his hands resting loosely at his sides, duffel bag packed and leaning against the wall behind him. In 2 days, he would report back to base before redeployment overseas. The rhythm of preparation felt familiar. Checklists, timelines, mental compartmentalization. It had defined most of his adult life. Yet as he watched the German shepherd move across the yard, something inside him resisted the automatic pull of departure. He had named her Valor 3 nights earlier, the word coming quietly but with certainty. It fit her. Her refusal to collapse in the storm, her decision to cross snow and steel to save her young. Valor's leg had healed enough for her to move freely now, though a faint scar marked where the snare had bitten deep. The 3 puppies tumbled clumsily through damp grass, their paws oversized and uncoordinated but growing stronger each day. The largest male, dark sable and bold, charged forward with reckless enthusiasm, chasing drifting leaves as if they were enemies to conquer. Mason had begun calling him Ranger, not out of sentimentality, but recognition. The pup possessed a natural assertiveness, quick to react, quicker to recover. The lighter female, whom Mason privately thought of as Ember, moved with sharper awareness, studying her surroundings before engaging. The smallest, whom he called Scout, no longer appeared fragile. His ribs were no longer visible, and his eyes followed Mason constantly, as though memorizing his movements. Olivia Brooks arrived mid-morning, boots crunching lightly over gravel. She carried a clipboard beneath one arm and wore her ranger jacket unzipped against the warmer air. There was a subtle softness to her expression today, though her posture remained composed. "They're thriving," she observed, kneeling to let Ranger sniff her gloved hand. Ranger barked once, then tugged playfully at her sleeve. Olivia laughed quietly, a rare sound that seemed to surprise even her. That one, she said, nodding toward Ranger, has working line instincts. High drive, strong nerve. Mason watched the interaction closely. You're thinking K-9 training, he said. Olivia nodded. In a year or so. If he keeps developing like this, he'd qualify for evaluation. The idea struck Mason deeper than he expected. He had served alongside military working dogs in multiple theaters. He had witnessed their loyalty under fire, their discipline under chaos. The thought of Ranger someday wearing a harness and badge carried both pride and gravity. Mason crouched and let Ranger paw at his knee, the pup's dark eyes bright with untamed energy. He'd need the right handler, Mason said quietly. Olivia studied him carefully. Handlers choose to stay, she replied. It was not a suggestion, only an observation layered with meaning. That afternoon, Mason drove into Cedar Ridge to meet Commander Travis Cole at a temporary field office the Navy had arranged for personnel processing. Cole stood by the window when Mason entered, posture rigid as always, uniform pressed, expression unreadable. The commander's features were sharply defined, strong jaw, dark eyes that assessed, rather than sympathized. Years of leadership in high-risk deployments had carved impatience into his tone, but beneath it lay a code of loyalty to his men. You've been quiet, Cole said without turning. Mason stood at attention, though something in him felt less rigid than before. Sir, I'm requesting a transfer after this deployment. Domestic assignment, training command. Cole faced him fully now, surprise flickering across his features before discipline replaced it. That's a shift, he said. You're one of my strongest operators. Mason nodded once. I'll complete the deployment, but I need to recalibrate long-term. The words felt unfamiliar, but honest. Cole studied him for several seconds, measuring resolve. You're not quitting, he stated flatly. No, sir, Mason replied. I'm choosing where I fight. A faint, almost imperceptible nod passed between them. Submit the paperwork, Cole said finally. We'll review it. When Mason returned to the cabin at dusk, the forest glowed amber beneath the setting sun. Valor lifted her head as he approached, tail brushing the ground in calm recognition. The puppies raced toward him, Ranger colliding with his boots before bouncing backward, ready for another charge. Mason set his duffel down inside, but did not open it again. Instead, he sat on the porch steps, allowing Ranger to climb awkwardly into his lap. The pup's heartbeat was strong, steady. Mason traced a hand gently along Valor's scarred leg, feeling the healed ridge beneath her fur. She met his gaze with quiet steadiness. He understood now that he could not shield the entire world from harm. War would continue. Greed would resurface in new forms. But the choice before him was not between weakness and strength. It was between distance and presence. He could return from deployment and pursue a path that kept him closer to home, closer to the forest that had revealed truth beneath steel and snow. Olivia's suggestion lingered in his mind, not just about Ranger's potential, but about staying long enough to build something rather than merely defend against destruction. As the last light faded, Mason rose and looked out over the ridge one final time before leaving for base the next morning. Valor lay with her pups at the edge of the clearing, silhouettes outlined against twilight. He felt the familiar pull of duty, but it no longer erased the quiet conviction forming inside him. He would complete the mission ahead. He would return. And when he did, he would seek a transfer that allowed him to protect what stood directly before him. For the first time, his future decision was not driven solely by war, but by choice. Summer settled over the Cascades in layers of green, sunlight spilling through tall cedar branches and warming the once frozen clearing below the cabin. Mason Hayes stepped out onto the porch and paused, letting the scent of pine and earth anchor him. 3 months had passed since his redeployment. 3 months of desert heat, long nights, and disciplined focus. He had returned safely, duffel slung over his shoulder, boots touching the gravel drive, with a steadiness that felt different from before. The cabin no longer greeted him as a place of retreat from memory. It greeted him as something built, deliberately, patiently. The front gate now bore a freshly carved wooden sign. The letters were burned carefully into oak. 2nd Ridge Haven. Mason had shaped the sign himself during his first week home, hands steady not from obligation, but intention. Valor met him halfway across the yard, her stride confident and unrestrained. The scar along her hind leg remained visible beneath her thick black and tan coat, but it no longer slowed her. She carried herself with quiet authority, ears high, amber eyes alert. She had gained weight in healthy muscle and moved like a dog who understood her ground. 2 of her pups were no longer here. Ember had been adopted by a young couple in Cedar Ridge, a schoolteacher named Hannah Whitaker and her husband Paul. Hannah was slender and soft-spoken, with warm brown hair that curled naturally at her shoulders and kind hazel eyes that reflected patience shaped by years working with children. Paul, broader and steady-handed, had grown up on a farm and understood working dogs instinctively. They visited often, sending updates and photos. Scout, the once fragile pup, now lived with Deputy Marcus Hale's family. Marcus's teenage daughter, Lily, had bonded instantly with him. Lily was 15, tall and thoughtful, her long dark hair often tied in a messy ponytail. She had struggled quietly after her older brother left for college, and Scout's presence filled a silence in her world. Mason had seen the way the pup followed her without hesitation, as if recognizing a gentle heart in need of purpose. Watching them together had reinforced something Mason already knew. Protection extended beyond forests and borders. It reached into homes and quiet rooms where healing unfolded slowly. Only Ranger remained at the cabin. He was taller now, legs lengthening into lean strength, coat deepening into a rich sable sheen. His movements were precise rather than clumsy, ears alert to distant sounds before they reached human awareness. Ranger trained daily under Mason's steady guidance, basic obedience evolving into focused drills that revealed natural aptitude. Olivia Brooks visited twice a week to supervise progress. Today she stood near the edge of the clearing, clipboard tucked under one arm, braid catching the sunlight. "He anticipates before you signal," she observed, watching Ranger track Mason's subtle hand motion. Her voice held professional satisfaction, but her eyes softened when they rested on Mason. "He's ready for evaluation." The small rescue hub had grown gradually. A weatherproof storage shed now held medical supplies donated by Cedar Ridge residents. A local veterinarian, Dr. Samuel Reed, volunteered twice a month. Samuel was in his early 40s, thin-framed with thoughtful blue eyes behind rectangular glasses. His dark hair was flecked with gray, and he carried himself with gentle restraint, as if mindful that animals often mirrored the emotional states around them. He had lost his own service dog years ago in a search and rescue mission and understood the bond without needing explanation. Under his guidance, 2nd Ridge Haven became a transition point for injured wildlife and abandoned dogs found along forest edges. Mason leaned against the fence post, watching Ranger execute a clean recall command, body pivoting sharply before sprinting back to heel position. Pride stirred in him, but it did not feel like the sharp surge of battlefield success. It was steadier, deeper. He still carried Daniel's memory. Some nights the desert returned in fragments, metallic echoes slipping into dreams. But those memories no longer defined the space around him. Pain had not vanished. It had shifted shape. It had become part of why he chose to build rather than withdraw. He had completed his deployment. His transfer request had been approved. He would begin a domestic training assignment within months, balancing service with presence. As late afternoon light stretched long across the ridge, Mason walked to the gate and rested his hand against the wooden sign. The letters felt solid beneath his palm. Olivia joined him, silent for a moment before speaking. "You didn't run," she said quietly. Mason looked out toward the vast sweep of forest that once hid steel beneath snow. "No," he replied. "I stayed." Valor settled at his feet, head lifted proudly, while Ranger stood alert beside them, future unformed but promising. The ridge was quiet now, not from absence of danger, but from vigilance maintained. Mason understood that the world beyond the mountains would never be fully free of conflict. Yet here, in this clearing carved from storm and steel, second chances had taken root. The forest remained protected. The puppies had grown into strength, and he was no longer the man who sought isolation to escape memory. He was the man who chose to remain, to defend what stood before him, and to turn loss into purpose. Second Ridge. Haven stood not as refuge from the past, but as proof that staying could rebuild what war had nearly taken. Sometimes the miracle isn't the storm stopping. It's the strength God plants in us to stay when it would be easier to walk away. Mason couldn't save everyone, but he chose to protect what was right in front of him, and that choice changed everything.
In our own lives, we may not fight battles in forests or war zones, but we face moments that ask us to stay, to love, to protect. If this story touched you, share it, comment below, and subscribe. May God bless and guard you wherever you stand today.